The snowstorm outside battered the reinforced windows of the Sterling mansion, but inside, the air was still, sterile, and smelled faintly of pine and expensive loneliness. In the center of the great hall, a 12-foot fir tree shimmered with crystal ornaments, each one costing more than a month's rent for most families in Boston. Yet the room felt empty. Arthur Sterling stood by the marble fireplace, checking his platinum watch for the third time in a minute. He wasn't looking at the decorations. He was looking for flaws. "The catering staff is 5 minutes behind schedule, Mr. Graves," Arthur said, his voice echoing slightly in the vast space. He didn't turn to face the head of security standing stiffly behind him. "Efficiency is the backbone of this evening. We have investors coming, not just neighbors." Mr. Graves nodded sharply, adjusting the earpiece that seemed permanently fused to his skull. "Understood, sir. I'll ensure the perimeter is secure and the staff remains invisible." Arthur sighed and glanced up at the portrait hanging above the mantelpiece. It was Elizabeth, his late wife. Her painted eyes were warm, full of a gentle chaos that had vanished from this house the day she died. She would have hated this: the guards, the schedules, the silence. Sitting on a velvet armchair nearby, 7-year-old Lily kicked her legs rhythmically. She was dressed in a pristine red velvet dress that looked beautiful but felt heavy. She clutched a sleek, expensive tablet in her lap, but the screen was dark. She wasn't playing, she was waiting. Her chest rose and fell with a faint, wheezing rhythm that Arthur, in his distraction, failed to hear. Meanwhile, in the bustling service kitchen, the air was hot and smelled of roasted turkey and anxiety. Sarah, the head housekeeper, knelt on the tiled floor, fixing the collar of her 6-year-old son Leo. He was wearing a hand-me-down suit that Sarah had pressed until it looked sharp. "Listen to me, Leo," she whispered, her hands trembling slightly. "Tonight is very important for Mr. Sterling. You stay in here. You draw your pictures, you eat your cookies, but you do not go out there. You have to be invisible today, baby. Please." Leo nodded, his large eyes scanning his mother's worried face. "I promise, Mama." But promises made by lonely children are often broken by the need for connection. 10 minutes later, while Sarah was distracted by a tray of silver flutes, Leo slipped out the service door. He didn't run. He moved with the quiet grace of someone used to being overlooked. He made his way to the small, dusty cupboard under the grand staircase, a secret kingdom shared by 2 children who didn't belong in the world above. Lily was already there, huddled in the shadows. Her face lit up when she saw him. "You came," she whispered. Leo reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, rough object. It was a crane, carved clumsily but lovingly out of a scrap of wood. "It's for luck," Leo whispered, placing it in her pale palm. "My mama says cranes fly away from the cold. It will help you breathe." Lily traced the wooden wings, a smile breaking through her pale features. For a moment, the cold mansion melted away. Suddenly, heavy footsteps thundered on the marble floor outside. Mr. Graves' voice boomed, "I want all access points checked." Leo pressed himself flat against the dark corner, holding his breath. The footsteps paused right outside the cupboard. Graves sniffed the air, muttered something about staff discipline, and walked on. Safe for now. Lily smiled at the crane, unaware that in a few hours, luck would be the only thing standing between her and death. The orchestra began playing Silent Night, the soft melody floating over the clinking of crystal glasses and the polite, hollow laughter of Boston's elite. It was 7 o'clock, and the Sterling mansion had transformed into a glittering fortress of wealth. Waiters in white gloves moved like ghosts through the crowd, offering trays of champagne and caviar to guests who were more interested in being seen than being fed. The heat in the room was stifling, a mix of roaring fireplaces and too many bodies pressed together in expensive fabrics. Lily stood near the edge of the room, feeling small in a forest of black tuxedos and floor-length gowns. The air felt heavy, like it was made of water, and every breath she took required a conscious effort. She reached into the pocket of her velvet dress and wrapped her fingers around the rough wooden crane Leo had given her earlier. It was the only real thing in the room, the only anchor keeping her from drifting away. She looked across the sea of people for her father. Arthur Sterling was standing near the towering Christmas tree, surrounded by 3 board members. He looked impressive, commanding, and completely unreachable. Lily tried to wave, to signal that her chest felt tight, but her arm felt too heavy to lift. A sudden, sharp constriction seized her lungs, as if an invisible hand had tightened a belt around her ribs. Panic flared hot and bright in her chest. She fumbled for the small purse hanging at her side, her fingers trembling violently. Inhaler. Need the inhaler. She unlatched the clasp, but her hands were slick with cold sweat. The blue plastic cylinder slipped from her grasp. It hit the polished marble floor with a sound that should have been loud but was swallowed by the swelling crescendo of the orchestra. It skittered away, spinning cruelly across the tiles before disappearing under a long table draped in white linen, completely out of reach. Lily opened her mouth to call out, "Daddy," but no sound came out, only a high-pitched broken wheeze. Her knees buckled. She didn't fall gracefully, she crumpled, her small body hitting the floor with a dull thud. A woman in a silver sequin dress gasped and dropped her glass. The sound of shattering crystal cut through the music. The orchestra faltered and stopped. Silence rushed into the room, louder and more terrifying than the noise had ever been. A circle formed instantly. 30 adults, titans of industry, lawyers, and socialites, looked down at the child writhing on the floor. But they didn't move. They froze, trapped by the modern paralysis of the wealthy, the fear of liability. "Is she choking?" someone whispered. "Where is her father?" another asked, stepping back instead of forward. A kind-looking elderly woman in pearls instinctively took a step toward Lily, her hand outstretched to help. Immediately, a shadow cut across the light. Mr. Graves stepped into the circle, his movements precise and cold. He held up a hand, physically blocking the woman's path. "Step back, ma'am." His voice boomed, authoritative and devoid of emotion. "Do not touch the principal. You are not medical personnel." The woman hesitated, looking from the gasping child to the imposing head of security. "But she can't breathe," she stammered. "We follow protocol," Graves stated flatly, pressing his earpiece. "Medical is en route. Touching her could cause injury for which you would be liable. We wait." The word hung in the air like a sentence. The woman stepped back, shame flushing her cheeks, but she obeyed. They all obeyed. Lily's eyes rolled back, her vision tunneling into darkness. She could see the shoes of the adults surrounding her, shiny, polished, expensive shoes that stood rooted to the ground. She could hear the distant murmur of voices discussing rules while her lungs screamed for oxygen. She was drowning in plain sight, on dry land, surrounded by people who had the power to save her but lacked the courage to break a rule. Lily's face turned a terrifying shade of gray, her hand reaching out to a room full of powerful adults who were too afraid of a lawsuit to save a little girl. Fear paralyzes, but love, pure, childish, unthinking love, moves faster than any rulebook. From the darkened service doorway, Leo watched the scene unfold with wide, terrified eyes. The smell of fear was different here than in the kitchen. It didn't smell like burnt toast or spilled milk. It smelled of expensive perfume turning sour on cold skin, of panic rising like steam from the circle of frozen adults. He saw Lily on the floor, her red velvet dress spreading out like a pool of blood against the white marble. He saw her mouth opening and closing, a silent fish trapped on dry land, gasping for air that refused to enter. He saw the way her eyes rolled back, seeking help, and finding only a wall of polished shoes and black trousers. "Stay back," his mother, Sarah, whispered frantically, her hand gripping his shoulder with enough force to bruise. Her voice was a jagged shard of terror. She knew the rules of this house better than anyone. Don't be seen. Don't be heard. Don't touch. Especially when it concerned the fragile, golden daughter of Arthur Sterling. To intervene was to invite ruin. "They have doctors coming, Leo. Don't look." But Leo wasn't looking at the doctors who weren't there. He was looking at the inhaler. He saw the blue plastic device lying under the long banquet table, half hidden by the linen tablecloth, just 10 feet away from Lily's convulsing hand. He remembered the sound of his own chest wheezing when the winter cold hit him too hard. He remembered Sarah holding that same blue plastic to his lips, counting softly, 1, 2, 3, until the scary tightness went away. He knew what Lily was feeling. It wasn't just sickness. It was the terrifying sensation of being erased, of the world continuing to spin while you slowly disappeared from it. "She can't wait," Leo whispered. Before Sarah could tighten her grip, Leo moved. He didn't run like a child playing tag. He moved with a desperate, singular purpose. He twisted out of his mother's grasp and bolted across the polished floor. He was small, a blur of motion in a room of statues. "Hey, you there. Stop." Mr. Graves' voice boomed like a cannon shot, cracking the paralyzed silence. The head of security lunged forward, his large hand sweeping out to catch the intruder. To him, Leo wasn't a rescuer. He was a liability, a contaminant, an unauthorized breach of the perimeter. But Leo was faster. He dropped to his knees and slid, his small body skidding across the marble like a hockey puck. He ducked under Mr. Graves' grasping arm, the wind of the movement ruffling his hair. He scrambled on all fours, diving beneath the white tablecloth where the inhaler lay gathering dust. His fingers closed around the cold plastic. It felt heavy like a weapon or perhaps a key. "Get that boy away from her," Graves shouted to a junior guard, his face reddening with rage. "This is a medical emergency. Security breach." Leo ignored the shouting. He ignored the heavy footsteps thundering toward him. He scrambled out from under the table and slid directly to Lily's side. Up close, she looked worse than he had feared. Her skin was the color of old paper, her lips tinged with blue. She was shaking, her body fighting a war it was losing. "Lily," Leo said, his voice surprisingly steady amidst the chaos. He didn't scream. He didn't cry. He knelt beside her, ignoring the towering adults who cast long, menacing shadows over them. He pressed the inhaler into her trembling hand, then wrapped his own warm, dark fingers around hers to guide it. "Look at me," he commanded softly, just the way his mother did. "Like the crane, remember? Fly." He guided the mouthpiece to her lips. She clamped down on it, her eyes wide with panic. "Push," Leo whispered. He pressed her finger down on the canister. Hiss. The sound was small, but in the silent room, it sounded like a thunderclap. "Breathe, Lily." 1. Leo counted, exaggerating his own breath, inhaling deeply through his nose. 2. A guard's hand landed on Leo's shoulder, rough and pulling. "I said get back, kid." Leo didn't let go. He dug his knees into the hard floor and anchored himself to his friend. 3. He counted, louder this time, staring straight into Lily's terrified eyes, willing her lungs to open. And then it happened. A ragged, desperate gasp tore through the silence. It was a harsh, ugly sound, but to Leo, it was music. Lily sucked in air, her chest heaving violently. She coughed, choked, and then inhaled again deeper this time. The blue tint began to recede from her lips, replaced by a flush of life. Her grip on Leo's hand tightened until her knuckles turned white. She wasn't letting go, and neither was he. The heavy oak doors at the end of the hall slammed open with a violence that shook the crystals on the chandelier. Arthur Sterling burst into the room, his face pale, sweat beading on his forehead. He had run all the way from the library, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "Lily," he screamed, the name tearing from his throat. He pushed past a stunned investor, shoved aside a waiter, and broke through the circle of tuxedos. He expected to see doctors. He expected to see his security team administering aid. He expected to see competence. Instead, the crowd parted as Arthur burst through, freezing in his tracks not at the sight of his daughter alive, but at the sight of the security team standing idle while a 6-year-old black boy did their job. The ambulance lights flashed red and blue against the snow outside, but inside Arthur's private study, the atmosphere was gray and suffocatingly bureaucratic. The room was a sanctuary of old money-dark mahogany walls, leather armchairs that smelled of cigars, and a fireplace that had long since burned down to ash. Arthur stood by the window, swirling a glass of scotch he had no intention of drinking. He watched the taillights of the ambulance fade down the driveway, carrying his daughter to the hospital. She was stable, the paramedics had said. She was breathing. But in this room, the air felt toxic. "We need to discuss the containment strategy, sir," Mr. Graves said, his voice level and devoid of empathy. He stood in front of Arthur's massive desk, a tablet in one hand and a stack of documents in the other. He didn't look like a man who had just failed to protect a child. He looked like a man preparing to audit a tax return. Arthur turned slowly. Containment, he repeated, the word tasting like bile. My daughter is alive. What exactly are we containing? The narrative, sir, Graves replied smoothly, placing the documents on the desk. He gestured to the leather sofa in the corner where Sarah sat, weeping silently, her arms wrapped tight around Leo. The boy looked small in the oversized room, his feet dangling off the edge of the couch, his eyes wide and confused. He was holding the hem of his mother's apron as if it were the only anchor in a storm. Graves continued, his tone hardening. We have a significant liability exposure here. The protocol was clear: wait for medical professionals. Instead, we had an unauthorized intervention by a minor, specifically a staff member's child who performed an unsupervised medical procedure on the principal. He saved her life, Arthur said, his voice low. He breached security, Graves countered, stepping closer, his imposing frame casting a shadow over the desk. Sir, look at it from a legal standpoint. If she had choked? If he had bruised her? If she had died? That boy's fingerprints would be the evidence of our negligence. The press won't see a hero. They'll see a billionaire who lets untrained staff handle his fragile daughter. The board is already calling. They want to know why a housekeeper's son was within touching distance of the heiress during a high-security event. Sarah let out a small, strangled sob. He just wanted to help, she pleaded, her voice trembling. He didn't mean any harm, sir. He loves Miss Lily. He calls her his friend. Graves snapped his head toward her. Love doesn't hold up in court, Sarah. And friendship between staff and principals is exactly the kind of boundary failure that leads to lawsuits. He turned back to Arthur, sliding a crisp document across the polished wood of the desk. This is a standard termination notice and a non-disclosure agreement. It offers Sarah a generous severance package in exchange for her silence and immediate relocation. It frames the incident as a mutual separation due to restructuring. Arthur stared at the paper. The words swam before his eyes. Termination. Breach of contract. Irreparable harm. It was a sterile legal way of saying they were going to destroy a family for the crime of doing the right thing. Sign this, sir, Graves urged, uncapping a heavy gold fountain pen and placing it on top of the document. It's the only way to stop the press from spinning this as a security failure. We remove the variable, we control the story. The room fell silent, save for the ticking of the grandfather clock. Arthur looked at Graves, whose face was a mask of corporate indifference. Then he looked at Sarah, who was shaking, terrified of losing her livelihood. Finally, his gaze landed on Leo. The boy wasn't looking at the papers. He wasn't looking at the scary security man. He was looking right at Arthur. Mr. Arthur? Leo whispered, his voice small but clear in the heavy silence. Is Lily okay? The question hung in the air, simple and devastating. It cut through the layers of protocol, liability, and risk management like a knife. Leo didn't care about his mother's job, or the lawsuit, or the scary man yelling. He only cared about the girl who couldn't breathe. Arthur felt a physical ache in his chest. He looked down at the multi-million-dollar contract designed to protect his reputation, and then back at the 6-year-old boy whose only crime was having a heart bigger than his bank account. Arthur picked up the pen, his hand trembling not from age, but from the sickening realization that his world punished heroes and protected cowards. Arthur stood alone in the hallway, the silence of the house amplifying the screaming chaos in his mind. The termination notice felt heavy in his jacket pocket, a lead weight dragging him down toward a decision he knew he couldn't live with. He had spent 40 years building an empire on logic, on risk assessment, on the cold calculus of profit and loss. But tonight, the math didn't add up. He walked slowly toward Lily's bedroom. The door was ajar, spilling a slice of warm, golden light into the dark corridor. Inside, the room was a mix of a medical facility and a fairy tale. Expensive monitors beeped softly, tracking her heart rate and oxygen levels, technology that cost more than Sarah earned in a decade. But Arthur's eyes didn't linger on the machines. They went to the bedside table. There, resting next to an untouched glass of water, sat a small, crude object, the wooden crane Leo had carved. It was rough, splintery and uneven, its wings slightly lopsided. In a room filled with imported porcelain dolls and limited edition toys, it was the ugliest thing there. And yet, it was the only thing Lily was touching. Her small, pale hand was curled protectively around it, even as she slept. Arthur sat in the armchair beside the bed, the leather creaking softly. Lily stirred. Her eyelids fluttered open, groggy from the medication but clear. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice raspy. "I'm here, sweetheart," Arthur said, leaning forward to brush a stray hair from her forehead. "You're safe. The doctors said you're going to be fine." Lily blinked, her grip on the wooden crane tightening. "The guards didn't move," she said. The statement wasn't a question. It was a confused observation that cut Arthur to the bone. "I couldn't breathe, and they just stood there, like statues." Arthur swallowed hard, the lump in his throat making it difficult to speak. "They were following rules, Lily. They were waiting for the ambulance." "Leo didn't wait," Lily said softly, turning her head to look at her father. Her eyes, so much like her mother's, searched his face. "Leo moved. He held my hand. He told me to fly like the crane. Don't let them be mean to Leo, Daddy. He's my hero." Arthur couldn't answer. He kissed her forehead, murmuring a promise he wasn't sure he could keep, and stepped out of the room before he broke down. He walked down the hall and stopped before the massive oil painting hanging above the mantelpiece in the private family lounge. It was Elizabeth, his late wife. The artist had captured her perfectly, not the socialite the world knew, but the woman Arthur had loved. She was smiling that half-smile she used to give him whenever he bragged about a business deal. "You build walls to keep the bad out, Artie." He could almost hear her voice, a memory surfacing from years ago. "But if you build them too high, you just keep the humanity from getting in. Strength isn't about power, my love. It's about protecting those who have none." Arthur stared at her painted eyes. She would have hated what happened tonight. She would have hated the guards. She would have hated the termination papers burning a hole in his pocket. Most of all, she would have been ashamed of him. He had become the system she always warned him about, a man who valued protocol over a child's life. His phone buzzed in his pocket, shattering the moment. He pulled it out. It was a text message from the chairman of the board. "Status update? Need confirmation that the liability variable has been removed. Press release is drafted." The variable. That's what they called a 6-year-old boy who had just saved a life. Arthur looked at the phone, then at the portrait of Elizabeth, and finally, down the hall toward the kitchen where Sarah and Leo were waiting to be destroyed. A fire ignited in his chest, not the cold anger of a CEO, but the fierce, protective heat of a father. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the termination notice. He looked at Mr. Graves' neat signature, the dense paragraphs of legal jargon designed to silence the truth. "No," Arthur whispered to the empty room. With a sudden, violent motion, he tore the contract in half, then in half again. The sound of ripping paper echoed like a gunshot. He walked over to the small fireplace in the lounge and tossed the confetti of his career into the dying embers. He watched the paper curl, blacken, and turn to ash. His phone buzzed again. He ignored it. He buttoned his jacket, wiped the moisture from his eyes, and turned toward the door. He walked toward the great hall, not with the stiff, measured gait of a billionaire executive, but with the long, purposeful stride of a man going to war. He no longer cared about being a CEO. Tonight, he just wanted to be a father worthy of his daughter's hero. The guests had not left. Curiosity kept them rooted in the great hall, waiting to see how the billionaire would handle the scandal. The orchestra had stopped playing hours ago, replaced by a murmur of hushed whispers that sounded like the rustling of dry leaves. They stood in clusters, clutching their empty champagne flutes, their eyes darting between the closed door of the study and the trembling figures of Sarah and Leo standing near the service entrance. Mr. Graves stood at the center of the room, his chest puffed out, radiating the smug confidence of a man who believes the law is on his side. He checked his watch, impatient for Arthur to emerge, and announced the necessary personnel changes that would restore order to the Sterling Empire. Finally, the heavy oak doors opened. Arthur Sterling stepped out. He had removed his tuxedo jacket. His tie was loosened, hanging slightly askew. He didn't look like the composed CEO who had greeted them earlier. He looked tired, raw, and dangerous. He walked to the center of the room, ignoring the guests, ignoring the press cameras that had managed to sneak their way to the front. He stopped directly in front of Mr. Graves. "Sir," Graves said, offering a curt nod. "I assume the paperwork is signed? I have the security team ready to escort the subjects off the property immediately." Arthur looked at Graves, then at the room full of people watching him. He walked over to the vintage microphone stand that had been set up for the holiday toasts. He gripped the stand with both hands, his knuckles white. "Can I have your attention?" Arthur's voice boomed, cutting through the whispers. The room went deathly silent. "Tonight," Arthur began, his voice steady but thick with emotion, "we witnessed a significant security breach in this house." Mr. Graves nodded solemnly, crossing his arms, looking vindicated. Sarah squeezed her eyes shut, pulling Leo closer, preparing for the humiliation of being publicly fired. "We have a protocol in this house," Arthur continued, his eyes sweeping over the wealthy faces in the crowd. "A protocol designed to protect the principal, to protect life. Tonight, that protocol was tested. And tonight, my entire security team, my guests, and we all failed." A gasp rippled through the crowd. Graves' smug expression faltered. "Sir?" he questioned, stepping forward. Arthur ignored him. He pointed a shaking finger at Leo, who was peeking out from behind his mother's skirt. While we stood frozen by the fear of liability, worrying about lawsuits and insurance policies, a 6-year-old boy broke every rule in the book to save my daughter's life. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't ask for a contract. He just acted." Arthur turned slowly to face Mr. Graves. The silence in the room was now suffocating. "Mr. Graves," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper that was amplified by the speakers. "You told me earlier that this boy is a liability. You drafted papers to erase him from this house to protect our image." Arthur reached into his pocket, pulled out the torn scraps of the termination notice, and let them flutter to the floor like confetti. "You are relieved of duty, effective immediately. Get out of my house." Graves' mouth fell open. "Mr. Sterling, you can't be serious." "The board will." "The board works for me." Arthur cut him off, his voice rising to a roar. "And if they have a problem with me prioritizing a human life over a policy manual, then they can accept my resignation in the morning. Now get out. And take your protocols with you." Stunned and stripped of his authority, Graves looked around for support, but found none. The guests, shamed by Arthur's words, looked away. With a final hateful glare, the head of security turned and marched out into the cold night, followed by his team. The heavy front doors slammed shut, sealing the cold out. "Everyone else," Arthur said to the stunned guests, his shoulders finally relaxing. "Go home. Hug your children. The party is over." Slowly, awkwardly, the crowd dispersed. The murmurs this time were different, humbled, reflective. Within 20 minutes, the great hall was empty. The silence that returned wasn't the cold silence of the beginning. It was the peaceful silence of a storm that had passed. Arthur walked over to Sarah and Leo. Sarah was trembling, tears streaming down her face. "Mr. Arthur," she sobbed. "Thank you. I thought we were lost." Arthur shook his head, tears shining in his own eyes. He knelt down on one knee, ruining his tailored trousers on the floor so he could look Leo in the eye. "No, Sarah. I was the one who was lost." He took Leo's small hand in his. "Thank you, Leo. You are the bravest man I know." "I'm just a kid," Leo whispered, smiling shyly. "Come," Arthur said, standing up. "I think we skipped dinner." He didn't lead them to the kitchen. He led them to the main fireplace, where the logs were crackling warmly. Lily was there, wrapped in a blanket, color fully returned to her cheeks. She squealed when she saw Leo and made room for him on the expensive Persian rug. Arthur did something then that he hadn't done in 30 years. He went to the sidebar, bypassed the whiskey, and found the thermos of hot cocoa the staff had prepared for the guests. He poured 4 mugs. He carried them over himself, serving Sarah first, then the children. He sat down on the floor next to them, loosening his tie completely. He took a sip of the cocoa. It was sweet, simple, and warm, so much better than the bitter taste of scotch and regret. He looked at Lily and Leo, who were already giggling, making the wooden crane fly through the air between them. He looked at Sarah, who was finally smiling, the fear gone from her eyes. As the snow settled peacefully over Boston, burying the old rules and the cold world outside, 4 people sat by the fire. They were no longer defined by their titles: CEO, housekeeper, heiress, servant. They were connected by the only thing that mattered. They were safe, they were together, and for the first time in years, the Sterling mansion felt like a home. True courage does not wear a uniform, nor does it ask for permission. Sometimes, it arrives in the smallest of hands to remind us that life is always more precious than any rulebook. When we choose compassion over fear, we do not just save others. We save the part of ourselves that truly matters. May this story remind you that a single act of kindness, no matter how quiet, has the power to melt the coldest winter.